This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop. A fundamental principle for initiating active piece play and fighting for control of the board's core. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a highly combative and popular response that immediately imbalances the position and creates asymmetrical pawn structures, often leading to dynamic middlegame play. Developing the knight to f3 is a fundamental move in the Sicilian defense, preparing to control the center and potentially castle kingside. This move initiates the classical Sicilian defense, establishing a flexible pawn structure and contesting the center without immediately committing to a specific pawn formation. This move immediately challenges black's pawn center, aiming to open lines and create dynamic play characteristic of the open Sicilian. This move, 3, cxd4, is a fundamental and theoretically sound response in the open Sicilian, immediately challenging white's central pawn majority and opening the c-file for black's rook. This move is a fundamental response in the open Sicilian, immediately challenging black's central pawn and aiming to develop a knight to an active central square while opening lines for white's pieces. This move continues the Sicilian defense, specifically transposing into lines where black challenges white's central pawn majority and prepares to develop the kingside. This move continues the development of white's kingside pieces, preparing for castling and reinforcing the central control established by the pawn advance. This move signals black's intention to adopt a fianchetto setup, common in many Sicilian variations, aiming to control the long dark squared diagonal and prepare for kingside castling. This move prepares to castle kingside, reinforcing white's central pawn majority and developing a piece to an active square, aligning with typical plans in the classical variation of the Sicilian defense. This move firmly establishes the fianchettoed bishop on the long diagonal, reinforcing control over the center and preparing for kingside castling, characteristic of many Sicilian setups. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental step in most open games. The logical continuation in this King's Indian setup is castling to secure the king and connect the rooks, preparing for central pawn breaks and active piece play. This move, bg5, introduces a pin on the knight, restricting black's development and potentially preparing for future pawn advances or piece exchanges. This move, nc6, prepares to challenge white's central pawn control and unblocks the c-pawn, aiming to develop pieces harmoniously within the Sicilian dragon variation. This move prepares to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the queenside or supporting a central pawn push, typical in many Sicilian dragon variations. This move develops a piece and prepares to contest the d4 square, aiming to challenge white's central pawn control and potentially hinder the knight on c3. This move, kh1, is a prophylactic maneuver typical in many Sicilians, especially those with a fianchettoed bishop, aiming to safeguard the king from potential diagonal attacks along the g1a7 or h2b8 diagonals, and to prepare for potential pawn advances or rook lifts. This move prevents the pawn on b5 from being supported by white's knight on c3, subtly preparing for queenside expansion or potentially a later b5-b4 pawn push. This move initiates a common pawn storm strategy in the English attack setup against the Sicilian dragon, aiming to create an attack on black's kingside. This move initiates a flank pawn storm on the queenside, aiming to undermine white's pawn center and create counterplay before white can fully consolidate their central initiative. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside. This move directly challenges white's control of the d-file and prepares to contest it, aiming to activate black's rook and gain counterplay along the open file. This knight maneuver challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to control key squares, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This move strategically repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to reinforce the d6 pawn and prepare for potential counterplay on the queenside or central. Pawn breaks. This move prepares to support a potential queenside pawn expansion with b4, reinforcing the knight on b3 and preventing immediate counterplay on the c-file. This move, 14, nb6, redirects the knight from its previous centralizing square, preparing to challenge white's strong centralized knight on d5 and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. This move centralizes the queen, supporting the advance of the f-pawn and preparing to connect the rooks for future central play. This move, nc4, is an active repositioning of the knight, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the c3-d4 diagonal if white's queen moves. The move 16, Rad1, reinforces the central d-file and prepares to potentially contest control of it, which is a key strategic battleground in this Sicilian Najdorf variation. The move 16, qd7, prepares to connect the rooks and supports a potential queenside expansion or central maneuvering with the queen. This move prepares to activate the kingside rook by clearing the way and supporting a potential e4-e5 pawn push or the defense of the king. This move brings the queen to an active square, eyeing the queenside and potentially preparing for further queenside expansion or supporting a pawn push, while also connecting the rooks. This move reroutes the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's kingside and potentially support a future f5 pawn push for queenside space. The move 18, rfe8, aims to unpin the f6 knight and prepare to challenge white's control over the e-file, while also potentially reinforcing the kingside defense. This move repositions the knight to c1 to potentially support a future b4 pawn advance or to redeploy to a more active square like e2 or d3, while avoiding the potential pin along the d-file if black plays nb4. The move 19, qb8, is a strategic repositioning, aiming to support the queenside pawn push and potentially prepare for na5 to contest the advanced knight on c3. The move nd3 aims to redeploy the knight to a more active central square, potentially supporting an e4-e5 pawn push or preparing to attack on the kingside, while also opening the d-file for potential battery formations with the queen. This move continues black's queenside expansion, preparing to challenge white's d5 knight and potentially open lines for their rooks. The knight repositions to f2, aiming to reroute via g4 or e4 to support the kingside attack or to reinforce the central pawn structure. The move 21, bd7, aims to reroute the bishop to a more active square on the queenside, potentially supporting pawn breaks like b4 or preparing to challenge white's control of the c-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to challenge black's control of the d7-h3 diagonal and potentially prepare for further pawn advances on the kingside or an attack on the light squares. Black trades the bishop for the knight to simplify the position and remove white's strong central knight, aiming to achieve freer piece play. This exchange of bishops on g4, with nx-g4, opens the g-file for white's rook and aims to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure while simplifying the position. The move a4 aims to exploit the slightly vulnerable queenside pawns of white after black's piece. Maneuvering, potentially creating a weakness or forcing concessions on the queenside to gain space or initiative. This move solidifies white's queenside structure against black's active pawn push, preventing the pawn from advancing further and preparing to develop the queenside pieces to more active squares. Black's qb7 is a flexible maneuver, preparing to potentially pressure the queenside with an eventual b4, or to reposition the queen to support a central pawn break or a kingside attack. This move repositions the rook to potentially challenge the c-file or support a kingside advance. A common theme in such Sicilian structures where white often seeks to control open lines. The knight retreats to d8 to prepare for a potential pawn push on the c-file or to reroute via e6, aiming to support the central pawn structure and potentially engage on the queenside. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to shatter black's defensive pawn structure and open lines towards the enemy king. This move concedes control of the central squares and weakens the kingside pawn structure, potentially creating targets for white's advanced pieces. This move, bxf6, is a tactical exchange that aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces by forcing the recapture. This pawn sacrifice opens the e-file for black's rook and queen, aiming to exploit white's slightly awkward king position and create attacking chances against white's central pawn structure. This move is a brilliant sacrifice that exploits black's weak kingside, forcing a capture and opening the g-file for the rook, leading to a decisive attack. This move is forced, recapturing the bishop that has just captured your own, and continues the material exchange initiated by white's sacrifice. This recapture on f6 opens the g-file and exploits the exposed black king, aiming to capitalize on the initiative gained from the pawn sacrifice. The king's desperate flight to f8 aims to consolidate the weakened monarch and escape the immediate mating threats arising from white's active pieces, although it leaves black's queenside vulnerable to further attack. This decisive pawn sacrifice opens the g-file, creating direct attacking lines against the black king and exploiting the weakened dark squares. After black's king moves, this pawn capture opens the h-file for white's rook and queen, creating immediate threats against black's exposed king, while simultaneously allowing black to activate their own rook on the g-file. This move aims to exploit the exposed black king by threatening a discovered attack with the queen, and potentially opening lines with the f-pawn. This move is a vital defensive maneuver, aiming to protect the king by creating a safe haven and potentially preparing for counterplay on the queenside or a central pawn push. This move sacrifices the queen to force a favorable exchange and liquidate threats, aiming to promote a passed pawn with tempo and simplify into a winning endgame. This knight sacrifice aims to disrupt white's attacking coordination and prevent the pawn push e5, while creating counterplay on the queenside. This knight sacrifice creates a powerful mating net around black's king by exploiting the weakened dark squares and the exposed position of the king after the pawn exchange.